Okay. All right. So this is session 3 of Cultural Anthropology, third module, and today's date is January 22nd, 2020. Let's start with prayer. Father God, we thank you for another opportunity to be in the class and learning about cultural differences, communication, so that we become better equipped in presenting your gospel in a clear way to our hearer, but also in a way that is faithful to the text of your word. Bless our time, bless all of the students, both in class or online, wherever they are, and may you use us and keep us usable for your glory. For in Jesus' mighty name we pray. Amen. Any question do you have so far? No? Okay. Then we can go to our PowerPoint. For this lesson, there are a number of very good videos I put on the Populi. We won't be able to watch all of them, maybe 3 or 4, but definitely I plan to watch 3 of them. And they are from one of the author of our textbook, Dr. Elmer, Don Elmer, and the one who wrote Cross-Cultural Conflict and Cross-Cultural Servanthood. So I think you will be blessed by them. But we will try to watch at least 3 of them. But let's go to our PowerPoints, and let me go on share. Okay. All right, the topic that we plan to discuss in this session from our textbooks are the role of culture as far as gender is concerned, the different modes of production, but also then more specifically, which I think will be helpful for Christians, missionaries, are in regard to cross-cultural differences and cultural communication. I think those are all of them, but specifically those 2 points are very helpful. I have to say from the beginning that I don't agree with everything in our textbook, even though written by Christians, regarding gender and gender role. But they are far better than some other stuff that you find these days. What is a gender? Basically, what it means to be a male or female in a particular culture. But I think this is not something cultural. And I know what I say sounds biased in our days, but this is biblical. What do you think? How does the Bible define male and female? First, they are both created in God's image, number one, and they are both equal before God. It's not the case that one is more intelligent than others, even though there are in some religions, for example, in Islam, that's what they teach. They are both created in the image of God, and they're supposed to work with one another. And woman was created as a helper to man, so on an equal base. And even I think the whole description of the creation of woman, Eve, that God takes a rib from the side of Adam, is interesting, figuratively, because God didn't take part from Adam's head, so that woman will have superiority over man, nor from Adam's foot, so that man will have superiority over woman, but from his side, equal. But in the structure, created men and women, definitely there is physiological, definitely biological characteristic, which are universal, they are not cultural. And I did a research on the secular views of gender. They say, oh, in some culture they have a third gender. Well, those are deviation, and those are abnormal situation. But and God created both male and female in His image. They work together, but for the purpose of harmony and organization and leadership, has given the leadership responsibility to man only in home and in the church, not in other areas. That what I mean is, I don't think as a Christian, I don't think there's any problem for a woman to become like let's say a president or a judge or a professor at the university or anything like that. But in a home and in a church, God, in His wisdom, has given the responsibility to man. Of course, there are reasons for that. In 1 Timothy talks about that, chapter 2. But nevertheless, it has nothing to do with either male or female intelligence ability or their spiritual ability, moral ability. It's just a functional difference, nothing else. Then in culture, you find different gender role. This is cultural. In different cultures, it varies. In different cultures, there's different sets of expectation and proper behavior and appearances for a particular gender. Again, there are some areas that I don't agree with our textbook, but in general, you got to be careful about that gender role in different cultures. Let me give you a few examples. Even here in this country, in our church, which is an Iranian church, we have different women when they come to church. You got to be careful whether I have to be careful whether I should draw my hand to shake their hand or not to shake their hand, because some wouldn't shake hand with a member of opposite sex, with men. Some do. So it's you kind of wait. What I do is in this kind of situation, especially if they have head covering, which it tells me they are, but even if they have become a Christian, but still they have those traditional priorities and values. So I just wait till they raise their hand toward me. I don't initiate that. Hugging, for example, in Middle Eastern cultures and most cultures, cross genders are not okay. So you got to remember that. And many minute details you have to remember. So I always suggest to missionaries, you got to focus on your target culture and just study whether Christian sources or secular sources, the proper modes of behavior, so we will not offend people. Let the cross be an offense, not our behavior. Gender socialization is a process of learning how to act according to the gender norms of a culture. In the Middle Eastern cultures, boys and girls start learning from early childhood what does it mean to behave properly as a boy or as a girl, and I think everywhere in this country too. Now here in this country and in the West, but we have a kind of confusion of gender socialization, and people think just we break all the borders and lines, and they think this is a sign of progress, which I don't think that's the case. Now, a question: a very valid question. I've faced this situation, in a literally, I had to give counsel in this situation. What if people, they do, is gender change by medical operation? Is it biblical or is it not? No. Okay, tell me why. Okay, do I make my question clear? I'm not talking about people who, they just, a man wants to be a woman or a woman wants to be a man. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about situation that there is deformity in sexual structure of the person, and I knew of a case that the person in Western countries, and maybe in some other countries they have this, maybe they have it or they don't, this technology that you go to a hospital and they do a test on your DNA, and they find out which chromosome, whether a female or male chromosome is higher in the person's body. Based on that, based on the whatever the deformity is, they may perform an operation. Is this biblical or not?
I don't have enough education about those deformities to know how to answer that correctly. I think I would want to know more information about what they're testing for and how the person actually physically is, not emotional.
No.
Emotional. This is physical. Before I made a decision.
Yeah. Good point. Yeah, I knew of a case of a person who had come to faith, who was in Iran for a while. Then he was able to leave the country, and when he left the country, he was able to communicate with me, to call me, and more openly, and discuss his situation. And this was a case of a man. I mean, he's known as a man, but actually he's in a woman body. And this nothing to do with feelings or emotion. This has nothing to do with, homosexuality, nothing like that. Rather, physically, I mean, I don't know exactly what he explained to me, he didn't go to all the details, was that he's like a, how do you say? He's actually like a woman that is in a man's body, but actually, as far as his sexual organ, there's deformity, and it's not pure male or pure,
female.
Yeah. Then that was the first time I was faced with such a question. I did research, I talked to some pastors, and in fact, one pastor, American pastor, explained this to me, that no, they can go, if they go to a doctor, if they go to a hospital, they do DNA tests, and they examine the body, and whether it's even possible to do anything or not. And if it is possible, and if for example, if the female DNA is much higher than male DNA, then they may make an operation. And he was able to leave and came to a Western country and went through that procedure, and they did an operation.
Did he become female or male?
He is now a female.
Interesting. And this is so hard because I would want to know more about how undeveloped he was.
Yeah.
And also, I think the ethical question really is, if God makes us a certain way, even if it's not completely formed, are we to scientifically make changes in either direction?
Okay, good question. But then there comes another question. For example, we do these days LASIK operation on our eyes. People, we do all kind of with eyes, with ears. Everything. Are these okay? For our hearts, they put all these devices. in my opinion, provided this is not a learned behavior, provided this is not just a feeling or a learned behavior, a person can feel and act, a man can feel and act like a female because he has learned these things, unfortunately, from his environment, or whatever happened to him, or maybe there was a rape or something. Usually I've seen that, or I heard, I'm actually not seen that, I read about it. But this wasn't any of those.
But the question then, again, is this is an ethical issue. Getting LASIK eye surgery is not an ethical issue. Or if it is, it's deeper than what I can think of.
Yeah.
And I think that it's not up to me to judge.
Yeah.
If this man said, I had this done because I had the chromosomes, what is it, XX, XY, whatever it is for women. And so my chromosomes were female and my body was mostly female. This is why I did it so that I would be happy. But I think there's always going to be that side of someone who goes through that surgery who's always going to question what was God's actual motive, making me the way he did. Yeah.
And again, I understand that side. I look at it this side too, that we live in a fallen world, and there are deformities. Now, all kind of deformities. Now, if we can correct those deformities, I don't have any problem with them. Now, including gender deformity. Again, provided that this is not a learned behavior, and this is not just feeling and emotion.
But how do they know if it's learned or not? Because in our psyche, we can't determine whether we've learned it or if we truly believe as a man that we should be a woman.
Yeah. Well, then comes conversation, the counseling. And I agree. One of the disadvantages in this case for me was I never met this person. It's been always long distance. But I told him that you need to go and also I realized in Western countries, you go to the best of the hospital, they don't care about biblical principles. They just look at it as some kind of a medical issue, physical issue. But I said, if you can, I asked him these questions as much as I could of whether anything in his upbringing, anything happened, and it seemed to me it wasn't any of those. But again, this is an issue that, got to think about it. I don't know how much in Nepal you may face that, but I know it's an issue in Pakistan, Afghanistan. I don't think in India. India, because of the British influence and lots of Western influence, it's forbidden. But there are boys and this is a horrible thing, but there are boys that even from their childhood, they dress them like girls. I think from what I know, and again, I don't claim to know everything, but it's a lot, and this is very common in Pakistan. It is for, originally they say it's kind of, they wanted to, just for fun, but I think there's sexual perversion involved.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the reason I asked, so they would dress them that way so they could justify doing something to them.
And they grew up like this.
Right.
And there's actually like a class of them in Pakistan. They're women. They have now grown up and they dress like a grown-up woman, but they were actually men.
And you would find that very interesting in a cultural setting like that, where women are looked down on and men are, have power, and to take their sons and do that to their sons is interesting.
No, part of it is also economical, because what I heard that you don't hear this thing happening to rich families, usually poor families. And even they sell their children like that, like a slave to these rich people for their pleasure, but whether they would take care of them and help them to grow up and go to college and all that, but that's the cost, unfortunately. It is true, it's something interesting to know. Islam, with all its claim to be, harsh on, any kind of immorality, sexual perversions such as homosexuality, in all kind of branches of that, it is in some way accepted. And you see that, I was watching a BBC program one time, and it had to do, I don't know if you remember, a few years ago, there was an Afghan man who went to one of these gay bars back in Atlanta, Georgia, somewhere around there, and started shooting and killed. It was during Obama presidency. I forgot where it happened, but it was a gay bar. And this Afghan man went and did that. And later on, it came out that he himself was a gay. And this BBC program had a report on this situation and mentioning that, in fact, the Bible is much, much harsher and stricter regarding the sin of homosexuality than the Quran. And it is in the Quran that in heaven, in Islamic paradise, there will be beautiful boys pleasing men. There are women, there are houris, there are beautiful women, but also there are boys, whatever preference of the person.
So when you were raised, because you were raised with the Quran, were you, what was your impression of that?
Yeah, it's interesting. It was never discussed. I don't recall. You see, one of the things here, and here comes the role of culture. Cultures modify these things, especially in Islamic societies. Because Islam came to Iran or ancient Persia as an alien religion. It came by force when in the 7th century, the Arab troops defeated Persians and captured Iran or Persia. So in many ways, you find that the Persian culture modifies some of the things in Islam. Now you go to some other cultures, this is something, if you remember, I said that in the first class, the difference between this class and religious or the word religion is this, that, for example, think of Islam, there are many different Islamic countries. The practices of these Muslims from one country to another, even within a country, varies. In Iran, when you go to southeast area close to border with Pakistan, this may happen. You may find things like this, but overall is illegal.
Well, it's similar to the culture of San Francisco,
Exactly.
Versus well, even Southern California, but or Georgia.
Yeah, exactly.
You're not going to see the same as much.
That's right. And these are the areas that, I mentioned there are things beautiful in every culture, but there are also some things that are evil, sinful. And the gospel must correct them.
So what religion did Iran and the Persians, what was there before?
Before the invasion of Islam, predominantly is an ancient religion called Zoroastrianism. Zoroaster. It is kind of a mixture of that's a whole different topic, but if you think of Gnosticism, I don't know if you're familiar with that. very much in that way. Sure. Now, gender status is a position that a person occupies in a social order that related to his or her gender, maleness, femaleness. You know, in English, we call different girls, boys, men, and women, but also gender status also has a deeper and more far-long consequences as far as a woman or as a girl, what kind of jobs you can have in the culture. Oh boy, you know, still in lots of Middle Eastern countries and among Middle Eastern people, to think a man becomes a nurse is kind of strange. Now here is accepted, nothing, no big deal. Maybe 50 years ago was a little bit different. I don't know, 50, 60 years ago. But even to this day, still to say a man is a nurse, nursing is a job for women, not for men. Or some other jobs like a construction worker. To think of a woman to be a construction worker is very strange.
And I'm just going to put a little feedback into that as a nurse, because I've been a nurse almost 40 years. So 40 years ago, there were many, many men
really?
entering the nursing profession. A lot of times, men will enter the nursing profession because they are moving into a higher, what's the word? You know, a lot of them go on to be nurse anesthetists. They're, you know, that's a stepping stone for them. But the other thing is they're very useful because of the power that they actually have. They're very protective. You know, patients will back down when you have a male nurse versus a female nurse.
Oh, yeah.
It's an interesting, different insight.
That's a very good point. That's very good. But it's still in, I don't know, for example, in Southeast Asia, but in Middle East, still they think of a nurse as a woman's job, not a man's job.
We have many male nurses here in the United States who have come from the Philippines. They're very trending into male nurses.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But like you said, not male.
Yeah. Now, again, comes with the gender status, how you're supposed to dress. And in some countries, like I mentioned about burqa, you see this picture. This is more common in Afghanistan during the Taliban, not now. Not right now. If you watch the news in Afghanistan, you see women dressing completely like Western women, or they dress like this. It's which to me, it's in fact that's more fair. If some people, if they by their own choice, they prefer to cover themselves, whether completely like a burqa or you know, in Iran or in most Islamic countries, they may cover their hair, but not all the way like this. It's up to, I think it should be up to person choice, not be forced. And if they want to dress without any covering, also, it's up to them.
Do you have, is there, the next section, is it why the burqa?
Oh, okay, I can explain that. The reason is, unfortunately, the roots of it is not good. And it's, again, an alien custom in these countries like Iran, Pakistan, or Afghanistan. It came from Arabia, from the time of Muhammad. Even before Muhammad, this was not practiced because they basically consider women as their own personal property. And the covering was so that nobody else would dare to look at them or desire them. Unfortunately, they look at women as like a commodity or for pleasure. So that's how they want to protect their own commodity.
So the women who are still covering most of their bodies are actually spoken for, and they're doing it out of respect for their.
Some of, I mean, as far as the country itself, for example, in Afghanistan, to the best of my knowledge, burqa is not enforced. You know, you can not have it. I mean, it's not enforced by the government. But in families, in villages. I think there's lots of cultural pressure for some to do that. In major cities in Afghanistan, like Kabul, I see on BBC. I got most of my news from BBC. I see them dress like some of them with just the hair covers. But when they show the streets, sometimes you see a person with burqa, less and less in major cities, and some completely like a Western woman. But even when they are not covered, their dresses are more modest.
So if you were a young woman and not spoken for, you did not have a husband, and did they have to wear a burqa if they were betrothed, or is it only if they're married?
Well, again, even if they're single, you see, they live with their parents, and it depends on the parents.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So is it it's not religious then?
Well, it is. It
Okay,
comes from Islam, but is mixed. It has been mixed with cultures. But the woman, you see, you find Muslims who argue strongly that a Muslim woman must be covered, and there are at the same time you find Muslim women and others, men and women, who argue that no, this is not part of Islam. That's a crisis within the Islam, how to define their own identity.
It's the same argument that Paul has about head coverings.
Yeah, and if you remember when we talked about that in 1 Corinthians 11, that was, he says there are clues that says, he said, judge among yourself, meaning he's referring to a cultural practice. What the head covering, if you remember when we talked about that, was a sign, was a symbol of something else, symbol of that this woman in the culture of Corinth, that this woman is not a immoral woman. She is married and she's faithful to her husband. Now, those things are important, but the manifestation has changed. So I say when I come to those passages, I say, and Paul gives the clue that, because he doesn't base his argument upon any other verses in the scripture, but he said, judge among yourself. Isn't it proper that a woman have a head cover? In other areas, when he wants to point, like in Timothy, when he talks about man leadership in home and in church, he refers to creation and to the fall. He doesn't refer to cultural issues. So that's how we can distinguish these things. If we read, that was part of the discussion, the picture of this noble woman in Proverbs chapter 31. She has many gifts, many abilities, and it's interesting to do a research of how Christian community tend to talk about Proverbs 31. But it's interesting when you look at Proverbs 31, this woman does lots of things. She's a businesswoman. She runs her house and she also does business. She's very, very active, both at home and in the society. It's not that just sitting there and doing cooking. No, she's very active, very active. And I truly believe one of the reason for the backwardness of the Islamic countries, and in fact, I find that in a book written by a Muslim scholar that he wrote his book on his country, Turkey. And he said one of the reasons that Islamic country, only one, one among many reason that the Islamic countries are struggle with progress is the way that we treat our women. Because you have basically put, let's say, at least half of the population at home. You don't let them do anything. You don't let them to get education or to join the workforce. You know, think of here, you know, like your own example. I mean, how many doctors, nurses, lawyers, professionals, scientists are women? If, for example, just imagine, if it's impossible, but just imagine if tomorrow all these female professionals were supposed to go home, the whole economy of this country will collapse. Now,
so what does that look like in the Middle East then?
well, again, you have a tug of war. The traditionalist, the old class conservative wants to push them down, but in all Middle Eastern countries, from Iran to Afghanistan to all the others, to more you know, countries like Turkey, even in Saudi Arabia, there's a push for progress.
Right, but it's not been completed.
No.
Therefore, so what? Okay, so in a hospital, and who are the nurses? Are there nurses?
No, depends which country you're talking about.
Okay.
In Iran, you find nurses and doctors, female, both. Even in Saudi Arabia, you can find female doctors, female nurses. You can, but depending, like in Iran, is pretty much open. Doesn't matter if you're a male patient or a female patient. But in Saudi Arabia, there are some restrictions, like some kind of physical examination must be done by a doctor or a nurse of the same gender of the patient. But if when you go to a country like Afghanistan, you see, countries like Afghanistan in general, doesn't matter whether you're a male or female, the education, the opportunities to go and study to become a nurse or a doctor is very limited. There are Afghan doctors and nurses, but most of them are outside the country. There are some inside, but the number of, there are female doctors, but there are few, and they have limited opportunity to practice. But even there, I mean, you cannot stop change and progress. It's happening, but it's, some places go faster, some places slower. But in general, that book it was interesting. It was written by a Muslim. He was analyzing his own society in Turkey. So that's one of the reasons for the backwardness of our countries. Because you just deprive half of the population, and therefore of education, job opportunity, and therefore you deprive yourself of lots of potential. And here, again, connected to gender and status are economic issue, production, exchange, how different countries operates, different economic system. Our textbook, Howell and Paris, identify 4 modes of economy or substance: foraging, horticulture, pastoralism, and agriculture. Foraging is hunting, gathering, very primitive. You just go and hunt or gather vegetables or hunt animals. Horticulture, it's different than agriculture because you domesticate animals, or you raise crops, but in a very primitive way and in a small scale, just to take care of your own personal needs. As you move to more advanced cultures, you find pastoralism, you know, that you are domesticated herd of animals on a larger scale. In this country, in lots of Western countries, and in other parts of the world, you know, that's itself an industry by itself. And connected to that, you find all different kind of fields and jobs and works. Veterinarians, let me give you an example. nowadays, veteran, this may sound strange to you coming from American culture, but I recall in fact, when I went to, this is a 40, how many years ago? 42 years ago, when I was in Iran. And I was, over there, they have limited universities to get into, so that there was this very tough entrance exam. But I was one of those few that passed that entrance exam. And I got into a very good university. But of course, that was my own fault. I didn't do a whole lot of research on it. I got accepted into the veterinarian college. I went there for 1 year. But I tell you, the problem wasn't so much the subject of our study, was the ridicule of people. That profession is ridiculed in some countries. Now, I have heard that things have changed in the past, of course, 42 years. But it's still in many, still in Middle Eastern countries, they laugh as a veterinarian doctor. So you're an animal doctor, or you're not a real doctor, or things like that. When here in most countries, this is an important profession, and not just for pets, but for the whole food industry. Now, agriculture, the difference of agriculture and the horticulture is, this is again in a much larger scale. Plant. You got permanent field for plant cultivation and much intensive work, and a major issue. And then, of course, now again, this is, in my view, our authors were kind of a little biased. They should have added industrial mode too, because you find industry, high tech in lots of these different countries. In Philippines, Malaysia, China, all these industry and high tech is not limited to only Western countries or Japan. In many other areas, it's growing. Maybe not in Africa, but I think they should include that too. Different system of exchange, reciprocity, redistribution, and markets. In reciprocity, it's basically that you, like what do you call it, bartering, that you only exchange items. You exchange gifts with no prices, with no precise accounting of values or precise expectation for time or type. And a balanced one is a form of exchange that you roughly exchange goods that are on an equal basis, or you exchange your service for an item, for a good, but basically on equal basis. Now, sometimes money involved, sometimes there's no money, but the tendency is always that people try to exchange in which both or one party seeks to receive more than what they gave. That's a negative reciprocity. Any question? No? Redistribution. Now, it's where you have a centralized authority collecting goods and services from a group of people and redistribute them. Can you think of an example? What would be an example of that?
In business or in just in general?
In different societies.
Yeah, I think that, this is kind of vague, but I would say, because I have a huge garage sale coming up this weekend, and I know that some of my things are going to be bought and then resold.
Okay.
But that's just.
But that's something I would say that is more like a form of reciprocity. You are giving a good and you try to get an equivalent, not precise, but somehow equivalent amount of money for that.
So what was the redistribution? Is that
You have a centralized authority.
you know, just industry in general, where someone produces the goods and then Walmart turns around and resells them. Is that what you mean?
No, that I think that would be more a market economy.
Okay.
This one, I think of like the former Soviet Union,
Oh.
or mainly the socialist country, the Soviet Union, that they collect the goods and services from a group of people and then they redistribute. They say, we collect the money, we collect the wealth, and we want to redistribute the money. You know, the problem, even in the definition of this kind of system, and I believe one of the reasons that this kind of system is centralized form of economy, centralized form of government, like the Soviets, left, communist, Marxist groups, they all fail, is because it kills the incentive for people to produce. You see, even in their definition, you notice they say we redistribute goods or wealth. They don't create it. That's the key point. So it's like we make everybody poor. We make everybody needy. I am for market economy, and with some, control because of the problem of the greed of human being. But in market economy is a system of exchange. People exchange their labor, whether physical, mental, creative, whatever, for money. And then that is exchange, that money exchange, you get buy goods and services. And you let that be free with some modification. In fact, I encourage you guys, everybody, there's a TV series. I mean, this was done a few years ago. In fact, our President Trump is in it too. This is about 10 years ago, or maybe more, I don't remember. When he was a businessman. It's called The Men Who Built America. And you can watch it on YouTube. You can find it on YouTube. Excellent for a program. And I talk about that even to some of my people in our church. Fascinating in that series was this, that, that comes as a surprise to many people. And I talk to them and say, like take the railroad system. In this country, the government of United States only built one railroad line that connected New York to San Francisco, just cross country. The rest of them are all private and built by entrepreneur. I tell to people, do you know the utilities like electricity, all these things? They're not, government didn't build them. They were all done by businessmen. The oil distribution, businessmen. And the only thing that US government, it's all deficiency, no system is perfect, was doing was to make sure there's no corruption. Make sure that everybody has a equal opportunity to grow. And then, throughout the years, yes, of course, there have been abuses in, especially in the labor force throughout, we are talking about 200 years ago to our modern time. But the society learned and adopted laws for protection of labor and, opportunities for people to rest or all kind of stuff. But it was the whole idea that the government would not interfere in the business of people and letting people to, you want to make money, if you obey the law of the land, make money. Because when you make money, then you hire a group of other people, and therefore the society progresses, moves forward. An example I know is my own brother-in-law. He's a genius entrepreneur. He had a business in Iran developing mushrooms, but they harassed him. The government official would come and ask for bribe or all kind of problems that he just said, forget it. And he left the country about, I don't know, it was 25 years ago, came over here, started his business here. And he has now, he's a very successful businessman. He has about 100 people working for him. So like a country like Iran loses 100 people, 100 jobs, here gain 100 jobs because of this free economy.
And as long as he pays his taxes.
Yeah, he pays taxes, the government gets the money too.
That's right.
Yeah, that's the market system. Instead of having a centralized authority collecting the money from everybody and redistributing that, it's doomed for failure. Okay, now there are different economic theories. The substantivist economic theory teaches economic behavior and motivation are vary by culture. True, yes, to some extent, like the example that I just gave you. Formalist economic theory, they believe that the logic people use to pursue economic goals are universal and can be explained by universal economic models. I think that in reality, it's a mixture of both. Some are cultural, some are universal. Okay. But here, again, this is what you find in the scripture, 1 Timothy 6:17. Would you like to read that for us, if you want to read 1 Timothy 6:17 all the way through 19?
Okay. So command those who are rich in this present age not to be haughty, nor to trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God, who gives us richly all things to enjoy. Let them do good, that they may be rich in good works, ready to give, willing to share, storing up for themselves a good foundation for the time to come, that they may lay hold on eternal life.
Yes. So I would say, as a Christian, our views should be, I find the market economy the proper way, but again, in a view of eternity, that as a Christian, we have to look at eternity. We have to see God has provided these opportunities for us to work, to provide for our own needs, our family needs, and to contribute to our society. But also keep in mind the eternal perspective that God wants us to use our income, our financial ability to support His church, to support the spreading of the gospel, and to help the people. So, the scripture gives balance to this purely secular view of economy. That's mine. Any question for this part? Now, the second part, we get into the differences, cultural differences. But before we go there, let's. There's a very good video. Let's watch that. It's getting cold. I don't know how to arrange this thing. Always cultural differences. Yeah. Okay. Now this is from one of our author, Dr. Elmer, let's watch that. And it happens as he's teaching a group of Russian students in Russian.
Welcome to another session of cultural communication. In this session, we're going to be dealing with cultural differences. There's probably an infinite number of cultural differences that we can talk about, but we're going to talk about only 6 or 8 of them, depending on our time, but it will give us a flavor for some of the cultural differences and some categories for how to identify these cultural differences. But before we get to some of the actual cultural differences, I have a quotation I would like to show you. And it was written by a person who was Anglican in background, and he wrote a book called The Miracle of Dialogue. This quotation had an influence on me early in my education because it caused me to think and to ponder what's involved in human relations, in human communication. Rule Howe says, every man is a potential adversary, even those we love. Only through dialogue are we saved from this enmity toward one another. Dialogue is to love what blood is to the body. When the flow of blood stops, the body dies. When dialogue stops, love dies, and resentment and hatred are born. One of the things that I was involved in earlier in my career was the doing peace conferences and conflict resolution conferences. I did a number of these in Africa, a number of these in Eastern Europe, a number of them in the United States, and then I was also involved in peace and reconciliation among businessmen, among church leaders, and various people like that. When you get involved in these areas, particularly as in Liberia, it was right in the middle of their civil war. In Croatia, it had been shortly after the war. In South Africa, it was the ongoing tension between black and white communities. When you get involved in these situations, it can get very discouraging. You realize that people don't have much difficulty hating each other. It seems it comes quite natural for them. And then eventually, of course, killing. So to realize that we are all potential adversaries, even those we love. So when you talk about even those we love, you say to yourself, well, look at the divorce rate. In America, it's 50%. Half of the people who commit the rest of their lives to each other end up hating each other and going their separate ways. So Rule Howe says that dialogue is a good part of what will help us to move forward and to be better at communication so that we don't have these situations of hatred and animosity and resentment and then eventually separation and maybe even doing harmful things to each other. Well, in this matter of cultural differences, it's often the differences that cause us the problems. Let me think with you about differences for a moment. When I grew up, there were categories in my father's mind that were categories of right, things that were right, he put in this category. Things that were wrong, he would put in this category. And things that were different, he would put in this category. But nothing was ever different with my father. Either it was wrong or right. No difference. Wrong, of course, was like him, not like him. Right was like him. And so we grew up knowing that you must agree with your father or you're wrong. If you're wrong, that could be trouble. I thought that my father maybe was a little too narrow, so I decided to broaden. Here was my category of differences now. Right and wrong, bigger category of differences. But when my children, well, when I married, of course, then my wife had certain things which were different. But I was inclined, or I wanted to put them in the category of wrong, because I still wanted her to look like me. And maybe she did the same when I did some things that she didn't understand. You have to ask her. But I at least tried to expand my category of differences. So some things were neither right nor wrong. They were just cultural differences. My brother's favorite ice cream was chocolate. I didn't care for chocolate. Is that right or wrong? It's a difference. It doesn't matter really. We can live with differences. Poached eggs, you discovered the other day. Right or wrong? No, just a difference, you see. A difference of opinion, a difference of preference. So I tried to create that category of differences. Well, eventually my children come along and they think their father's a little too narrow, a little too rigid. So now they have a category called differences too. Well, you can understand that that creates trouble now, difficulty, because things that they put in their category of differences, see, we agree on some things here, but then they go farther, and that's where the difficulties come. So in that situation, for example, a certain kind of music, they said, Dad, it's just our taste. It's not your taste, it's our taste. I say, no, I think it's not a matter of taste. I think your music is wrong. No, Dad, you're wrong. Our music is a different, and so now you're getting into this tension. How late can we stay out at night? Well, I think that on school nights, you should be in at 9 o'clock. When it's a weekend, 10:30. Oh, Dad, that's terrible. No. We should, our friends can stay out until midnight on weekends. Oh, I said, no, I don't think so. See, I'm putting in a category, that's too much, that's not good. That's wrong. But Dad, that's just, you don't understand, you see. They wanted to put it in the category of differences. So now they've got their category of differences. But now what happens with their children when they come along? Is it going to be like that? Where does it stop? You see? So that in culture, the category of differences seems to be almost infinite now. And the categories of right and wrong seem to be very small. Sometimes almost non-existent. So people in America say, well, that's me, that's not you, that's me, it's just different. Don't get worried about it. Well, that's one of the tension points, of course. When you're a Christian particularly, the Bible articulates, the Bible speaks of rights and wrongs, things that we can believe, things that are right, and we can engage in those things. Other things that are wrong, they're sinful, they go against God's will and God's purposes, and we should avoid doing those. And we believe that God makes those things right or wrong for good reason. They protect us. They help us to live better, more fulfilled, more satisfying kinds of lives. Now, many of us have the difficulty, not so much of this area of differences, but of a reasonable category of differences. But when we find something that should be in the category of difference, our tendency is to put it in the category of wrong and to judge people. We're continuing that idea of making judgment because we assume that our way is the right way. And if you do it differently, at least it's suspicious, if not wrong, or it's inferior, if not wrong. Let me just illustrate this with a couple of stories, and then we'll begin to talk about the specific cultural differences. Which do you think is the greater sin? To tell a lie or to lose your temper? Which would be the greatest sin of those two? A lie or losing your temper? What do you think? What would be your judgment on your cultural perspective? Vitaly?
Yeah, I would say in the majority, people would prefer to lie than lose temper. Temper is more express the person and be afraid of negative things. But while it seems like easier to tell a lie than something, then the whole idea of hypocrisy, you talk nice to the man, but you just haul out with not losing temper. So when you say, oh, one losing temper, let's see about men, but it seems hypocrisy in this case is lesser sin, while it's a big question.
Probably the majority of the world would believe that losing your temper is a greater sin. Because when you lose your temper, you violate the relationship. And the majority of the world is concerned about preserving the relationship. And that's actually a good thing. So to tell a lie in many cultures is not so bad, especially if the lie doesn't do damage to the person, doesn't hurt anyone. And of course, we have in America what we call white lies, little white lies. Oh, that's such a beautiful baby. Well, maybe the baby looks like a bulldog or a bus or something, you know, but we say it's such a pretty little white lies. Well, those, of course, are pretty much harmless, and we want the mother and the father to feel good. And so. But we'll get in a moment to other kinds of things, lies in terms of people making commitments and not fulfilling commitments. But they never intended to fulfill the commitment, but they said they would anyway. So that's a different kind of lie, because now you have expectations based on something. Well, let's talk, in the West, typically, to tell a lie is worse sin, because we want truth. We value truth. We want people to be honest. We want to be able to take you at your word. So if we can't trust what you say to be true, then we can't trust you. And so to tell the truth is a much greater virtue. And losing your temper happens all the time, but people get over it and we move on with life. So very different depending on the culture that you're in. So if you're in another culture where losing your temper is a serious sin or a serious violation of cultural pattern, then the relationship can be broken actually for years and years because of losing your temper. Because for them it's a greater sin. So by knowing that, we can adjust. We can be careful. I know missionaries that seem to get upset, maybe angry, and they'll shout at a local person, a national person. And to them, they think nothing of the shouting at somebody in disgust or frustration. Because in their family, they shout and get frustrated with each other all the time, and it's nothing, we move on. But in that culture, we don't move on. That does serious damage to the relationship. Now, the other person, the local person, might carry on as though things are all right, but the trust is gone for a very long time, sometimes for a lifetime. So we have to know these things. Let me give you another story. I need to say it's fictitious because it has to do with life and death. It is fictitious. So you are on a boat, and the boat capsizes, and there are 3 people beside yourself, and you're able to save only one person. Who do you save? Do you save your mother? She's been a good mom. Do you save your spouse, whom you love deeply? And if you're not married, you have to assume that you're married and that you love your spouse very much. Or do you save your child, who's a lovely, delightful, obedient child? Who do you save? Who would you save if you had to make that decision? Now again, there's another principle behind here that goes beyond the story. So just play with me, just work with me on the story, okay? And if your spouse is sitting next to you, your answer will be easy. At least if you don't want any more discussion on that. All right, who do you save? All right, give us a try here. Yeah.
I think a child, because adults can help themselves, children are helpless.
You might think that perhaps the spouse could make it to safety or something. In this case, the story allows for not for that to happen. So, but save the child. Okay, that's one answer. We'll come back to that in a moment. Would somebody save a different member, the spouse or the mother? Well, how many of you would save your mother? What?
Would you please give us a little broader context? Because it's really difficult.
It is.
When you talk about a child, what age is the child? And maybe if it's a small child, like 3-year-old, he won't make it himself or herself, right?
Nobody's going to make it unless you take care of them.
No.
So that's the
Oh,
rule.
so it's me and somebody else.
It's you and somebody else, and everybody else will die in the story. Yes, it is very
I'm
difficult.
signing off.
No, you can't sign off because then everybody, you can't save anybody then.
How do I save that person? What's the saving device?
Because you have the capacity to take them
just
safely
take
to
it.
shore.
Okay.
Maybe you're a good swimmer. You can swim.
All right. No saving river.
No. For the purposes of the story, it has to be very clean.
Okay. I'm signing off.
You can't. It's not allowed in the story.
I'll probably vote for the child.
You would probably say. All right, fair enough. There are no right or wrong answers here. It is a moral choice.
Is there an option not to save anyone and to die with all of them?
Not in the story. That's not an option. Okay. Okay. Vitaly, do you want to give us your answer?
Yeah, I assume the question is really try to expose the cultural understanding of who is more important in the culture. Some
We're going to get to that.
mothers or something, but really, I know we're waiting so long. I think everybody dies already. We couldn't decide who to save.
And that has happened in real life.
I assume because it's so hard decision. So I don't know right now. I don't think in our culture is really, we have this great, some like patristic culture or maternal mother's culture with mothers important, but I don't think in Russian culture it's too much of anything. So it will be somewhere like that impulsive things to do it. So this is very hard for us to decide. We don't have this strong cultural idea of who's more important of this, so it will be more like harder to decide.
Why would you save your child? Let's talk about that. What would be the rationale for saving the child versus the other two?
Well, in my personal situation, I love my husband more than any other member of the family, even more than my child. But at the same time, I know that my husband's choice would be to save his daughter and see that both of us are alive. And my mother's choice would be that also because she's 60 years old and she had life already. She has seen enough, and the little girl has future. And we will have good memories about all of that. And I think that in some cultures, in this case, they usually save those who are old and those who are young, because older generation has wisdom and younger generation has future. And well, I can't save my mother and my husband and my daughter at the same time, so I will just choose to save my daughter.
And that's a very good reason or reasons for saving your daughter. And in fact, in America, that would be the most common response. Some would choose a spouse or a mother, but the most common response is a child. And the perspective is because the mother and the husband and the wife would want the child to be saved. And so you would do that because that seems would be the consensus. Why would you save your spouse over your child? And any reasons there? Now you're going to argue now with the other decision.
No, I just want to give another reason why I would save my husband if that was the decision of all fundamental of the family. So because life would be miserable without your second half. When you just get married, you become like one, and it's like a piece of paper glued together. So if you just try to get one part of the paper, then another part is just really hard. And life would be painful without the husband. And in my personal situation, I would never marry another person. That's my decision. And at the same time, sometimes they say you could get another husband, and then why not just save your daughter? But you can get another child if you get married again, and you have only one mother. So it's a difficult decision.
It is, yeah. All right, so the bond of husband and wife is very strong. The love, the loyalty that you build up, the desire to be with that person for the rest of your life. Now, under what conditions would you save your mother? She would be the choice of the one. What reasons would you have for choosing your mother over the none? No reasons? You seem very ungrateful to me. What has your mother done for you? She's carried you for 9 months. She nurtured you. She protected you, and now nothing? Many of them say what you had said, that you can always get another child, you can always get another husband, but you can never get another mother. In many cultures, the mother will be saved. And so in many cultures, not even necessarily materialistic, but the idea being that you will have obligation to parents for all the years of what they've given and what they sacrificed for you. And this is actually would be an easy decision for me. Of course, I would say my mother and my father, whoever was there, because I think of all that they have done for me, think of all that they've given, how they've sacrificed. The point here is one answer more or less right than the other answer? And the response is no. Any of those three choices would be acceptable given your cultural history, given your cultural traditions, given how you think about life. In the majority of the world, gray hair, my hair, is considered to be wisdom, and you want to protect wisdom. You want to protect the older people because they carry the wisdom of the ages, and you rely upon them for advice and counsel and caring and so on. But in the West, in my country, once you're over 50, you seem to be less and less important, less and less necessary. And pretty soon, you're just left somewhere. So the youth are the ones who are given all of the emphasis. And the youth, of course, particularly in the technological age, the youth know all the technology. And they're very good at it. They can manage all the machines and things like that. And so they are very valuable, and we must honor them for what they have. But age is not revered, not honored so much in Western culture as it is in the other. Right or wrong? Well, maybe different.
We invite you to participate in the International Bible Teaching and Translation Project.
Universities or in your sphere, when she said,
Much needed value of prayer and financial support. For more information, please visit www.tvcenter.com.
Yeah.
now, let's make a transition then into specific differences, but I want to start with a question. Muriel hinted at it earlier when she said, what are the rules of living in your culture. So I want to go back and push you on a couple of those issues. If I'm coming into Russia and I'm going to be, let's say that I'm going to be a professor in your universities or in your public school, in your school system somewhere, and I'm going to live here for the next, 15, 20 years, I hope, because I love the Russian people, I'm looking forward to learning the language, and I know that I must learn it in order to be effective here. But what else do I need to know in order to be effective and successful and feel happy in your culture? You need to advise me now. I'm paying you each $1,000 an hour to give me very important advice so that my next 10 years will be happy, fulfilling, effective years. Tell me what I must know about Russian culture. The time is clicking here, and I'm not hearing anything.
Yeah, you have to learn how to eat raw pig's fat.
Oh, if I eat raw pig's fat, then I will be a happy person.
Yeah, I mean, solid would call it. It's really special food.
And that will make me effective in living here.
I think so. I mean,
Okay.
a big part of it. So
All right.
at least it makes
Pig's fat.
yeah, at least it makes you be friends with most of the Russian men who eat it.
So actually, that's one of the connections with my colleagues, my other men, Russian men, who need to eat together this pig's fat.
When I came to America and fighting bacon, this is one of the best things. And we just put it in the bread and started eating. And one of my friends called his friend and said, those Russians, they eat raw meat. But for us, the bacon was not this great. It's something like this. But it's something like, okay, the food that may connect you, but I'm not sure it's going to make you happy. My point, it may connect you better with the culture. Yeah, it makes you better. But I'm not sure it's making you happy.
Yeah. Okay, well, but it'll make me happy if I have friends.
No, they'll make connections.
All right. What else besides eating this pig's fat stuff? What else should I do to be effective, to be fulfilled, happy, successful?
Yeah, you should realize that the people don't see life as black and white colors in Russia, so there are much more gray areas here. You expect.
Can you give me an example of a gray area?
Like paying taxes, it's in gray area, like many laws, gray area, and like truth is more relative for Russians than for Westerns. It may affect the way you live in Russia.
Okay, very good. So things are not so rigid in black and white. That's important. Are there things that are black and white and rigid that I must not compromise?
See, there are some moral values that are still black and white, and there are some borders which should cross.
Good. Someone else. I'm paying you a lot of money to give good advice here. So far, very good.
Okay. I would say that schedules are not all that rigid here in this country, and a lot of Russians prefer to have conversations at the time when they need them. That means that you can easily build relationships if you feel like you can spend time with that person, and even if you take some time off the schedule and just put it in. Sacrifice something for that person's sake, and that's when the real relationships start to form. And here you just often you just show up at the door and say, "Hey, I feel sad or something. Have a cup of tea. Just talk about it." And that's it's not like you're in a schedule where you can't really interfere all that much.
You have to schedule a cup of tea about a week ahead of time.
Yeah, exactly.
But
and
then the sadness
if you
is
want
gone.
to be a productive professor, you have to actually, love your students. Being competent is not enough here. It's about relationships as well.
How do you show love to students? Because love is culturally defined.
You show respect for them by respecting their views and everything, by supporting them in make them feel like they are important, that they are adults, by listening to them and to their experience and how they share it, and things like that. Again, you just talk to them, and what they especially like to do is talk to you over a break. When you want to know a little more about yourself as a person, as a human being, as a personality. They value a lot.
So being available.
Being available and being open and sincere. I mean, they would want you to open up your heart and share everything about you. That's not needed. But they want some sincerity, some genuine attitude to them. That would help you to exactly easier.
Okay, very good. Olga, we'll take you as the last one.
Some foreigners like to take pictures of some things that look not really nice.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the Russians don't like it. It's better not to do it. I don't think it's common of foreigners, but still, in the cases.
Okay, so put the camera away sometimes. Don't, because that can be rude. People would see that as not very kind. Okay. We're going to finish this session now. In a few minutes, we'll come back and start a session on some of the major cultural differences that come out of anthropology and the field of cross-cultural communication that tend to separate the Western values, Western ways of thinking versus the majority world. Now, by West, we think of Western Europe typically. Russia's often included in the West, but I also understand that Russia is a wonderful mixture of West and East cultures. They really tend to flow back and forth there. And so it'll be interesting how you handle some of these cultural differences that we put on two extremes. What we'll try to remember is that while we're talking about rather extreme opposites, the fact is that most of us operate in a fluid way. Sometimes we can be very time-oriented, sometimes we can be more concerned about the event, what's happening, who's there, and how do we make the most of this time together. So, see you in a few minutes.
Okay. Good. Any comments, question? Yeah. It's interesting that one of the students referred to the question of role of food in a culture. And you find that all over the Bible. Fellowshipping. In Revelation 3:20, Jesus said, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone opens the door, I will go in and eat with him. The role of food, the fellowship of that. It's very important. The view of time. The question of, it's important whatever profession you do to be competent in that, but also show love. It's not just purely competence. Taking pictures, yeah, interesting. In some cultures, people don't like that. They feel an invasion of their privacy. All right, let's take a 10 minutes break and then come back. Stop this.
He's a great